Hello and welcome to the podcast, Widening the Circle, a Sacred Story. So I'm your host, Sky Williams-Tao, and I use they, them pronouns.
And I'm Jamili Omar. I use she, her pronouns.
And for this episode, we're discussing the theology section of the report. And we're specifically doing our second episode on the theology section. And for this episode, we're considering the question, is anti-racism work theologically grounded? And as I mentioned, this is our second episode focusing on theology. So in the first episode, we talked with Reverend Sarah Skotchko. And if you haven't seen that, we totally invite you to watch that one or listen to that episode. And we kind of talked about theology generally and broadly with her. And so in this section, we're really focusing on the recommendations in this section of the report. The 4 recommendations that the Commission on Institutional Change has for this area of Unitarian Universalism. And before we formally start getting into discussion, I want to invite us into a chalice lighting and start with a body practice. So taking a second to breathe and to ground and to check in. This is a point in the podcast and the video to just remember where you are. That is not plugged into this technology, what's around you. What are you resting on? Are your feet touching the floor? Your abdomen, you're touching somewhere? What can you feel? Can you hear? What is around you? And then coming back, plugging back into this time together, I'll read our chalice lighting as Jamili lights our chalice. We return to love again, again, and again. We value what is true. We honor holiness. We try and we grow and we fail and we rest and we try. We are here together now. We need one another. We covenant.
Thanks, Sky. I think there's a few times we've talked and specifically about this section and just how big this section is, and in part because it's not lengthy, it's just the concepts are so big. And we wanted to come back to the section and really talk about our definitions of theology as a starting point and what we mean by that term. What do we mean by theology? And if you're coming out of a different religious tradition, you might know that as a very narrow study of the nature of God or the study of religious belief. And in Unitarian Universalism, I think we take a little bit different, maybe a broader definition of that. Do you have a handy definition for theology?
Yeah, so my definition that I use is sort of theology as thinking about the stories and considering the stories of our lives. And that's both the stories of the stories we tell about ourselves, so how we tell stories that help create us as human beings, and also the big stories of, the creation of the world and why the moon is the way it is. In part because I went through a piece where I was really thinking of science as a theology and what that meant to my definition of theology, to really think about like a scientific creation story of the Big Bang, and not to take away from the way that I think that science is underpinned by factual evidence and sort of this long tradition, but rather to take science and think about what does it mean in a story sense? What does it mean not like in not just a way that is about facts and about the way things work and about discovering the way things work, but what does it mean to tell these stories, and what do they mean in sort of more of a religious, looking at it through a religious lens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What about you? What's your theology definitions?
I think it grows and expands the more I learn. I do like to hold on to that last little bit of the definition of religious belief, because I do feel like there is something important and valuable there in those two words about religion and about belief. And I also think we can have religion and belief without a God or a divine figurehead of sorts. So I think it's really, it's fun to tease out and I don't know, to think about a shared theology in terms of what we talked about last time with Reverend Sarah about the things that bind us, and that when we look internally at a faith, this faith, it is, you know, the theology is that thing which binds us together, which I do think is expressed through story that you were talking about.
Which I think brings us to another sort of central question we wanted to look at, which is, does Unitarian Universalism have a theology?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, what do we think that is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, I absolutely think it does. And as the Widening the Circle points out, it's not a believe anything you want theology. That's not the theology, is you can believe anything you want. I do think there are, we talked about the metaphor of a house. There is a floor, there are walls, there's a ceiling. At one point, Reverend Bethany and I had got down that metaphor pretty far, and we're like, so how much can we redecorate Unitarian Universalism from, we're going to talk today about grounding and roots and history, right? How far can we change it before we've remodeled the whole house, right? But that doesn't deny that there's a house here, and that we are in it. There's a floor, there's walls, there's a ceiling. There's a really great book. Rebecca Parker co-wrote a house, the house metaphor one. Is it House for Hope? No.
Don't know the book, but I definitely know that Reverend Rebecca Parker
wait,
is.
look, I did.
Yeah,
I got it right. House for Hope, Rebecca Parker and John. So, yeah, there we are. So details there. I do think there's a lot of really rich material. They also wrote an article for UU World. So if that's something that's of interest to folks, searching on the UUA for that article is fascinating.
Yeah, and I think it's, I think one thing I really love about this section is they talk about our theological legacy, the theological legacy we've inherited, and like use language that's like, this is our precious theological inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about, it's the first recommendation from the commission in this section is re-engaging with our theological legacy and its use today will ground our efforts to welcome all who are drawn to our faith and provide resources for resilience for Unitarian Universalists in these difficult times. So I think they really do have a call to think about our history and to think about this house that has been built and who built it, and you know, what does that mean for those of us who shelter in it now, who live in it now. And I think the other thing we talked about bringing up here was also this piece that's about covenant. And in thinking about modern, I think there's this question of our legacy, right? And how that's reinterpreted and how that's re-engaged with. And I think there's also this piece that is about modern Unitarian Universalism, where I think covenant is a really central idea to modern Unitarian Universalism. And one of the framings I think we talked about it as is as a creed for Unitarian Universalism.
Yeah, that's sticky, isn't it? So Unitarian Universalism advertises itself, promotes itself as a religion where you don't have to subscribe to a creed. There is no proscribed belief or litmus test for membership or for participation. And then we come to this concept of covenant, where we believe very strongly that we get to decide what our behavioral agreements are. Feels like a creed that we're going to say we believe in covenant. So how do we can we just accept that the one creed that we have is the belief in covenant?
And I think it's also, when we're talking about this discussion, I think it's important to acknowledge that at least one cause for some of the reactivity, I think, in Unitarian Universalism around specifically the language of creed. Because I think there are actually some spaces where you could talk around that and not use that word, and that would be more okay with people. And we have this recent legacy of folks who are coming out of religious wounding, and usually that's coming out of Christian contexts with religious wounding around, I think, like, in some ways around people asking them to hold to a creed in non-consensual ways. And like, that is a real trauma. I think that people can carry. I think some of where that can become a problem is when people bring trauma into our congregations and then don't do healing around their trauma. I think any trauma anybody carries can become this thing that where people are then acting out of a lot of woundedness and are hurting other people out of that woundedness because they've been hurt and have never really done the sort of deep spiritual healing work that I think is actually religion at its best can offer, and spiritual communities at their best can offer. But I think in thinking of creed, I was thinking about this, like, I think creed is almost a neutral thing. Like, it's a thing that you hold. I don't know the definition of the dictionary definition of creed, but if we think about it as a thing that you hold central to your religion, as a thing that you feel bound to and accountable to, that's not a bad thing, like, on the face of it. And in fact, I want to be accountable to things, right? Like, I want my religion to ask something of me. And when that is used in ways that are abusive or non-consensual with folks, I think that can cause a lot of pain and hurt.
Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting tie. So I just looked up creed because I'm on the computer. And it's got several definitions. I think the one we might want to use, though, it says a set of beliefs or aims which guide someone's actions. A set of beliefs or aims which guide someone's actions. And so in that sense, we don't all have to believe in the same creed. We all probably have one, though. And in our youth programs, we often have students write a credo, which is a snapshot of what their beliefs are in this moment when we go through the program. Seems like a really useful activity for all of us at various points in our lives to just sit down and take stock. What do I believe in? What guides my actions? And in that sense, we can encourage Unitarian Universalists into a more growth-minded or a growth-oriented creed rather than a fixed and static creed. So you said the word non-consensual, and I was really thinking too about calcified, that a lot of times our creeds, and we're going to move into that concept of covenant too, that our covenant becomes calcified. And it's something that fit very well for a particular stage, whether it was a stage in our individual lives or a stage in our church life. And things change, the world moves on, right? The free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and we move forward, but that creed or that covenant stays the same and it's become calcified. And I think part of our conversation about covenant, as hard as it is, has to be about change. And I said earlier, I think that this document, the Widening the Circle document, really is a call to adapt our covenants, to bring them into what we know today that we didn't know. And when was our covenant and our official documents written? 85? When were they last? Yeah. See, I think it was 80. I think it was that long ago. We should look that up though. But in thinking about what covenants we have in Unitarian Universalism, it's expressed through the 7 principles. We covenant and affirm too. And this is a call to update, is to say those are out of date. We know more now. We need to update our covenant with each other.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question of where our covenant lives. Like so I was doing the survey for the section 2, Article 2 Commission, which is the group that's updating the principles right now. And like, that's a group where I'm just like, you know, everybody, I think it's important to pay attention to them, right? I think this is going to be very important, and I hope folks are paying attention to them. But I was doing their survey, and one of the questions in their survey was, are the principles our covenant? Do you think the principles are a covenant? Like, definitely yes, sort of yes, maybe, sort of no. So I think it's an interesting question of actually where a covenant lives. Like, I think the church I grew up in also had the piece that I rewrote for our intro reading as the covenant, which is, love is the doctrine of this congregation, the quest for truth is our sacrament, and service is our prayer, to dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to share our strength and fellowship, thus to be covenant, is explicitly the covenant of the church. Yeah. And that is actually just a poem that a Unitarian minister wrote in like 1870 or something. Like that is where it comes from. You know, it's a little bit updated. Like, I think, you know, some of the words are different, but that's it's actually not like a, you know, like I think it is an interesting question. Where does covenant live? I guess, and what is the covenant? Especially because I think it's such a central theological piece, right? And if we're talking about, you know, like, our covenant needs to be updated, part of the question, I think, is what covenant are we actually living right now? Like, what is the covenant that we are holding right now with each other?
Yeah. And so if we kind of go back a little ways, pre-merger, we emerge out of the 2 strands of Unitarianism and Universalism, and it's that Universalism, I think that, well, in our setup discussions, we were kind of getting the most excited about, because, and there's a couple places in this section where we're very specifically relying on that legacy of universalism, the concept of universal salvation, that there's no one damned to hell, maybe there's no hell, right? So that legacy of where that comes out of, in the text, Dr. Ortega wrote, if we believe in collective salvation, we must also believe in collective sacrifice. And so I think there's a sense here that the widening the circle and the anti-racism work is really pulling on that thread of the worth of every individual, and our striving to make then that a reality in this plane, that we're not waiting for an afterlife for that salvation or that perfect world, that we're called to make it happen in this life, in this world. And the universalism that brought that to us in our legacy.
Yeah, I remember when we were doing some of the setup conversations for this, I think you made this really good point about, like, the idea that you have to act in this world is not true in all religions. Like, and that we were talking about that part of that driver, that, like, you really do need to act, is that, like, this idea, what you just said, right? This idea that salvation isn't something that you that is decided when you die, and it's not something that you can get by just praying to God or praying to somebody. You, like, if we believe in salvation in this life, then we have to act to make that salvation possible. And so it has that call to action, I think, in that theological heritage, and in the way I think it's right? Not just in the house that we've inherited, but the way that house is being sort of lived in today.
And I want to bring us to a quote on, it's page 15 of the text, which again is Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, who I quoted last week. She says on page 15, we are the theological inheritors of teachings on universal salvation. There is no winnowing out of the supposedly unworthy that can be named sacred among us. It is our very universalism that is at stake when we turn away from the impact that our institutions have on the same communities and groups that society encourages us to dehumanize and make small. So she's really laid that out clearly, that as inheritors of universalism, we cannot exclude anyone, including the ones that society expects us to make small or to ignore.
It makes me think of, again, in some of our conversations, we were talking about this, a movement, I think, in our faith from liberal to liberatory. And there's a recommendation, the second recommendation is, in this section, is reinterpretation of our theological legacies in these times should be liberatory and articulate our commitment to affirming and welcoming those who have been marginalized in our largest society and within our communities and organizations. So some of that is, Reverend Sophia is laying some of that theological groundwork, and this is sort of the recommendation that I think the call in the modern day. And you did this really, I don't know, like this really interesting thing about sort of with this movement from liberal to liberatory.
Yeah, and the thing that I think is critical to understanding liberalism is that there's this idea of, in liberalism, this endless growth, that there's a best thing that we're aiming for, and in liberatory ideology and mindset, we're not working for this individual point, we're working for everyone, that there's liberation for everyone. I'm not sure I can say more about that.
Yeah, and I think part of where it also lies for me is in that question of covenant, right? Like I think I in my understanding of that theological sort of idea, we totally have covenants with ourselves, right? And those can be damaging, and they can be liberatory, and they can be all sorts of in between those things. And we have covenants with each other, and again, those can be damaging, and they can be liberatory, and all sorts of things in between those things. Well, I guess this is also a question where the relationship ends and the covenant begins. So I guess relationships can be damaging, and I think the idea of covenant is really more centered in how we promise to be with each other, how we would like to be with each other, it has like a level of sort of best selfness in it. And also I think a little bit of, I think in best case, right, it also has a little bit of accountability to our promises, to what we're doing.
And also to what we believe about the world. So there's an accountability to our values. Reverend Matthew Funk Crary describes covenants as aspirational. This is how we wish we could, if we were ourselves divine. This is how we would want to be with each other, knowing that we're human and fallible and going to make mistakes. So they're aspirational, and they're accountable to our values, or our values are accountable to our covenants. I don't know what direction that goes, but that we don't write covenants based on values we don't hold. And so if we've written, as Unitarian Universalism, if we've written a covenant that says we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, so assuming that Article 2 does in some ways state our covenant, every person, we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, that means that we've written a covenant based on that value. How do we then enact it? And there's a lot of behaviors we participate in that don't enact that agreement. that don't actually value every individual, and not just random individuals in the world somewhere I don't know, but the person sitting next to me in the pew.
Right. So this is part of, we had a question that was like sort of, and I think this is in this chapter too, that's, you can do social justice work that is not theologically grounded. And so the question, is our work theologically grounded? And if so, how, right? I think, because I think it's part of what you're saying is like, you know, like if our social justice work is sourced out of covenant, if it's sourced out of our belief in universal salvation, and specifically that, you know, there is universal salvation, but we have to work for it now if we were gonna get it ever, then what does that mean about, then it holds us to a certain level of, it means that it can't be an abstract in a particular way, I think.
Yeah.
That how we are with each other, how we are in our lives matters.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what our humanist friends brought to us was the really concrete permission to doubt an afterlife, right? And so we have that in Unitarian Universalism, that we're always saying, well, there might not be an afterlife. So how do we behave now? This is the one life we've been given. So how do we do it now? And that's the question, right? Is how do we enact universal salvation now, whether there's an afterlife or not? How do we do it now and here?
Yeah.
And it's got to come out of relationship.
Yeah, right. And I think covenant is one way of understanding relationship, right? And I think it's specifically it's our theological way of doing it and thinking about it. And I think a key part of that sort of liberatory thing is also, as sort of Reverend Sophia was saying, right, is also this idea that we can't have salvation with our, like, just our group and our congregation. Like, we don't get to cut ourselves off from the world and create a little utopia by ourselves, which we have some legacy of doing, right? I mean, like, there is some legacy of folks who sort of went off and created utopic communities, which I think can be models, right? Can be offer resources to folks, offer places of sanctuary to folks, can offer, again, models for how things might be done. But we live in a broader world. So thinking about our theology, thinking about covenant, we've talked a lot about what theology is and how it grounds in our history, how it grounds in our social justice work, and we wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about the recommendations and also pivot to our question, which is anti-racism work theologically grounded? And then think about the recommendations. We've talked about a few of them, but they're re-engaging with our theological legacy. The 4 recommendations the Commission on Institutional Change has in this chapter. First one is re-engaging with our theological legacy, and its use today will both ground our efforts to welcome all who are drawn to our faith and provide resources for resilience for Unitarian Universalists in these difficult times. The second one is reinterpretation of our theological legacies in these times should be liberatory and articulate our commitment to affirming and welcoming those who have been marginalized in our larger society and within our communities and organizations. The third one is acknowledgement of anti-oppression work as a theological mandate is essential. We need to resurrect, research, document, and teach the words of Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, LGBTQ individuals, women, and others who have been largely lost, though their presence has been with us throughout history. These constitute a valuable tool for our times. And 4 is educating about the covenantal nature of our faith will allow communities to support and nurture one another as the overall US climate becomes more hostile to and disinterested in a life of faith. And
one of the challenges I think that we'll have when we look at recommendations throughout the rest of this text is how we take those recommendations and apply them in local either congregations in local settings, faith communities, whatever, but at the local level and not at the UUA level. And I really am struck by the very last action, because to me, this feels like the most directly actionable. It should be as an action, right? The very last one of this whole chapter is develop resources for training on engagement with, rather than avoidance of conflict, as a part of change and transformation. And I just think of all the, as we've talked through this text, so many of them are not easy to do in congregational setting or in small settings. And this one so is.
Yeah.
We can work on being, able to address conflict and manage change better. What are your responses to the rest of these as you look over them and think about how you would implement them in a congregation?
Yeah, and I want to also say, like, so I read the 4 major recommendations, and then each recommendation has an action. So that one Jamelia was reading was one of, there's 3 actions in the final recommendation, and that was the 3rd action. This will make more sense if you also are reading alongside us in the book. I mean, honestly, these actually feel very actionable to me. Maybe, I don't know, but like re-engaging with our theological legacy, some of the actions are like centering the theological work of Black scholars, Indigenous scholars, and scholars of color, which we totally have in our faith. Like we have, Black Unitarian Universalists, Indigenous Unitarian Universalists, Unitarian Universalists of colors, and theologians who hold those identities. And both professional and lay, whose knowledge is resonant for our times, and provide more resources for layers who wish to engage in theological conversation, equip our theological schools to engage in the work of continual education. So like the 3rd one, equipping our theological schools, may not be a thing like a local congregation or community can do, but you absolutely can engage with our theological heritage, and specifically with this idea of centering the work of Black Unitarian Universalists, Indigenous Unitarian Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists of color, and also theologians from other faiths who hold those identities, whose work is resonant with your theological leanings.
Yeah, and I have to say, sometimes it's as easy as naming somebody's identities to know who we're engaging with. Because we might have a favorite quote or a reading that we've referred to often and just don't realize that that person is from a marginalized background. And naming them both allows us to know who they are and what their context was, but also to reinforce for those around us that, oh, this person is here, this person does exist and has contributed well. We started doing that. Reverend Bethany had us starting to do that in worship. Before we were using photo images, we were listing people's identities as they were relevant when we use their readings. So it doesn't have to be things that are intensely complicated to make these happen. It can be really pretty simple.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about, if you do have beloved theologians who hold more privileged identities, who are white or male, like cisgender male or whatever, right? I think it's worth taking a second to think about how their identities may have impacted their work. And, potentially like doing some biographical reading, or, I think there's a sort of, reaching into our rich tradition, and also just being aware that all of our identities have impact on our theologies, wherever we come from.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and I think it's the same actually of our, I think reinterpretation of our theological legacies should be liberatory and articulate our commitment to affirming and welcoming those. I have a strong feeling that stewardship is like, I think it's often used in a financial context, and I think it also has this meaning of, you know, we use the metaphor of a house, and like that we renovate our house. Like we, you know, like that we, to be good, to be like Unitarian Universalists that will leave a powerful legacy that will for the people who come after us, and also to be Unitarian Universalists that offer a like liberatory and a powerful call to the world. We have to be remodeling our house. We have to be doing this work of reinterpretation and re-understanding to speak to the times that we're in. And I think the call from the Commission on Institutional Change is to sort of specifically in that lean towards the liberatory, right? And towards this commitment to affirming and welcoming everybody, to widening the circle.
Yeah. Well, and given my interest in education and my position as religious educator, I'm really excited about those opportunities to engage people, adults, in the growth of their own understanding of their faith, and healing both for people who identify as white and people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. To do that healing involves growth in your spiritual development, right? And so I'm really excited about those calls, that this is a call for all of us to examine our spiritual wounding and where we want to grow spiritually, and to engage in our own faith development process. And some of the actions in here about being more inclusive in our curriculum, being more inclusive in representation. Religious educators, we talk about that a lot. How can we have more diverse picture books in our libraries? How can we read more diverse stories? How can we adequately represent both who is in the congregation and who we want in our congregations, and who we're inviting into our congregations. And so to have adequate representations of those. So I feel like those calls also are not necessarily incumbent on the religious professionals. Those are incumbent on all of us and achievable by all of us.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we talked about this a little bit in the previous call, but I think it's a daunting task, right? I mean, like it's a big task, and it's absolutely not one person's task. Like we talked about, in this idea of relationship, I think we also have this belief in democracy. And I think not like, I feel some cynicism about the way democracy is functioning in the US in the modern day. And I think,
given that we're recording this on January 6th, 2022, 1 year from the insurrection, no.
Everything is fine.
Yeah.
And I really do believe in like this idea that people should have agency over their lives, and that there is a way of doing politics and power that is about us figuring it out together.
Yeah. Democracy in the one person, one vote sense of democracy, but democracy in the sense of one person, one voice.
Yeah.
That we're all coming to the table and able to use our voices.
And that we're also attentive, right, to whose voice is not at the table, and why, right? Does that mean there's a systemic barrier? Does that mean somebody needs help? Like, what does that mean about who's not there? I think that's, yeah. I was thinking, you go.
I was going to take us back to our last conversation with Reverend Sarah, and she used the word gadflyism. And just to get your understanding of what that is, and then to take us a little bit to this tension, this push-pull, and why there's a tension on whether we should engage in anti-racism work specifically, and why Unitarian Universalists should work to undo oppression.
Yeah, and so gadfly, in very short form, there's a lot of resources out here if you are interested to do more research into this, or if anybody following along with us is. But in short form, there's a minister from Washington named Reverend Todd Eckloff who wrote a paper or a book called the Gadfly Papers that he then distributed at GA, and there's questions about why he distributed it the way he did and being out of covenant in the way he distributed it. And that was a couple years ago. And then that, I think, has become this sort of rallying point for, I think, folks who are don't believe that anti-racism is an important part of Unitarian Universalism. And so gadfly as a whole has become sort of a representation of that group, and that there is that tension, I think, very actively happening right now. I mean, I use it, I will say, I don't think it's like half of Unitarian Universalism thinks we shouldn't, half does. I think it's more like there's a minority that thinks we shouldn't, and they're a loud minority, I would say.
I think it would be more accurate. It'd be interesting to find out, but I think it's more accurate to talk about whether people agree with this anti-racism work and this anti-oppression work kind of on a continuum. That my experience with people is there's those of us that are staunchly on one side, and there's folks that are staunchly on the other side. And most of the people I interact with are along this continuum of, I don't understand it. I don't understand the grounding for it. I don't understand how it's called for in my faith. I'd like to learn more, or, I don't want to learn more. I think it's not there. Like, I think there's this continuum, the spectrum. And folks for whom, the march of the 1960s was critical in their formation of their identities and their faith. And really have engaged the work. And I think the call in this text is to engage the work that's needed for today. And it's different than it was in the 1960s, and it's still needed. And so I think that this book is controversial. It is a challenge for a lot of people on a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, and I think this feels like it also brings me to this third recommendation, which is the acknowledgement of anti-oppression work as a theological mandate. I mean, this is their recommendation, right? That is their recommendation, is to see it as a theological mandate and is essential. We need to resurrect, research, document, and teach the words of Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, LGBTQ individuals, women, and others who have been largely lost, though their presence has been with us throughout history. These constitute a valuable tool for our times. So I think that sort of brings me also back to our question of, is anti-racism theological? That was not our question. Is anti-racism work theologically grounded?
Well, and I want to maybe take us towards the end, maybe not the end, with the words of Reverend Leslie Takahashi, who was on the original Committee on Institutional Change Committee on Institutional Change. And I don't remember, she ended the committee, or did she leave in the middle? I don't remember that timeline.
Yeah, I think so. The Commission on Institutional Change, I think, is what you were looking for.
Commission on Institutional Change.
And she was actually, I think, the chair, and I think she was there for the whole time.
And so she wrote early on the blog, Why Institutional Change. This is what she wrote. Institutional and cultural racism operate together to build systems of unequal treatment and benefit, which denies the inherent worth and dignity of persons, one of the theological pillars of our faith. Addressing racism in its institutional form and acknowledging its cultural forms is so central to the work we should be committing ourselves to as a faith movement. Without institutional change, we cannot address the larger frame. Incidents of personal and interpersonal racism will continue, and yet institutional change allows us to put in place systems that educate and prevent harm, increase equitable outcomes repair relationships harmed by interpersonal and personal racism, and reduce harm in the interim. Why does this matter? Because many of those who would be among the most enthusiastic members of our faith expect our institutions to reflect their faith values and are repelled when we do not. The comment to a visitor based on an ignorant stereotype or racial, cultural, or class assumption harms that person and denies the welcoming nature of our faith. Our first principle is not about allowing any opinion to be expressed, but about cultivating practices that can affirm a diversity of people and experiences. And again, that was Reverend Leslie Takahashi.
And I think one of the things it brings up for me is this widening the circle concept, right? And we've talked about, is our anti-racism work theologically grounded? And I think it's also this piece of like, just like this, who are we losing? And like, what are we losing? Like, we have theologians, you know, who are Black theologians, Indigenous theologians, theologians of color, and we have lost Black theologians, Indigenous theologians, and theologians of color. And we are hurting the ones we have, right? I mean, like, and man, that doesn't feel like what I want for a religion.
So our action for this discussion is I want to invite everyone to do some research, do some digging. You've heard our interpretation of theology and our interpretation of the Unitarian and the Universalist and the UU history. Go and do some more digging. There are a ton of websites out there. Put in Unitarian Universalist history and you'll find some really good ones. Learn about our theology. And really curiously, go and dig in your own context, your own congregation, your own fellowship. When did that come about? How is it founded? Who are the leaders? And see what you can discern by doing that historical engagement. Anything else you want to add today, Sky?
Something in me that's just like the joy of like, you know, figure out what your house is and where do you, what house do you want to live in, right? Mm-hmm. Come help us build a house that we all want to live in together. Like, because I want to build a home with folks, you know?
Yeah. Oh. Well, everyone go in peace, go in power, go do good in the world, and go knowing you are truly deeply loved.
We'd like to say a few thank yous here at the end of the podcast. Thank you, as always, to Unitarian Universalist Justice Arizona, or UU Jazz, especially to Janine Gelsinger and Phoebe Dubich. And finally, thank you all for being with us. As a reminder, you can contact us at uusacredstory@gmail.com, and we look forward to hearing from you.